Howdy and welcome to Bamberger Ranch. My name is Roel Lopez. I'm the director of the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute, and we're going to continue our Leopold Live series here at Bamberger, continuing to talk about the 5 basic tools introduced by Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife management. These 5 tools include cow, axe, plow, fire, and gun. And what we hope to do in the upcoming months is show you how those tools can be applied, but with very specific projects and objectives. And so with me is Dr. April Sampson. She's the executive director of Bamberger, and she's going to tell us a little bit about Bamberger and what we hope to cover in the series.
Great. Thank you so much, Roel. We're really excited to have you and your colleagues from the Natural Resources Institute back here at Sela Bamberger Ranch Preserve. And we're excited about continuing our journey into Leopold Live version 2. Like Roel said, we'll be providing more detail and more useful information regarding the 5 tools that Aldo Leopold championed. Here at Sela Bamberger Ranch Preserve, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission is landowner stewardship, outreach, and environmental education. So we have many Central Texas school children that come visit us every year for hands-on science-based environmental education lessons, and we also lead showcase tours and workshops for landowners interested in practicing restoration and good land stewardship. So we're very happy to be partnering with Natural Resources Institute, and we know that you'll benefit a lot from the information that we are going to be talking about during this new version of Leopold Live.
So let's go ahead and get started.
Great.
One of the most important aspects you can do for wildlife and your wildlife valuation is supplemental water. Behind me, you see a windmill, and that is just one of the various ways you can provide supplemental water for wildlife and as part of habitat improvement overall. Here on the Bamberger Ranch, we employ all sorts of different methods. This windmill actually is not active anymore, but those tanks behind me are still active. So we have a solar pump that brings it 1.5 miles uphill to fill these tanks, and then there's a trough hidden behind all of this ragweed that can fill up with a float when we need it. Here we've had almost 21 inches of rain year to date. So we are flush with water, so we don't have to run this right now. So those tanks are full, but we don't need to waste that water for wildlife, because wildlife can still move around the ranch and get all their water needs that they actually have to have. So when you think about setting up water stations and you think about supplemental water, you kind of have to know the lay of your land. You need to know where your permanent water sources are, if you have any, or where the wildlife is to provide a little extra water. And you can do that in the forms of ground guzzlers that we'll talk about. But if you have the economic means to do this, windmills are a really good way to go. But there is a lot of cost associated with this. There is the cost of drilling the well. Then you have to case the well. Then there's also the cost of erecting the windmill and the maintenance on the windmill, on top of the trough and on top of the tanks. So this isn't for everybody. And like I said, this isn't active. But if you put up a windmill or any supplemental water site, that qualifies you for 10 years. So that checks one of those boxes that you have to do for 10 years with regular maintenance. Okay, so that's really the big point of that. So with the drought cycles that we have here in Texas, the reason this windmill isn't active is because that screen gets clogged. And with the way our perched aquifers are set up, we have a lot of subsidence events during those drought cycles. So we would actually have to uncase this well and re-drill it, which just isn't affordable for us here at the ranch. But to go find out a little bit more about how we do supplemental water, we're gonna hop over to our next station and learn about wildlife guzzlers.
So one of the things that we're talking about today here on the Bamberger Ranch is supplemental water as part of your wildlife tax valuation process. And often on the larger pieces of property, if you think about water distribution, for the livestock industry, really what the rule of thumb is to have a water source every mile of on your property. So scatter those out each mile, with the idea of being that cattle walk no more than a half a mile to any water source that's out there on the ranch. Well, sometimes when you're talking about smaller animals, then you're distribution of water sources may be smaller and smaller. So you can just take that 640 acres that make up a square mile and divide that down into smaller parcels. When I'm out on properties, and I think one of the first things to do on larger scale properties is to go and modify the water trough itself. And so here we are on this piece of property, and what they've done is they have an escape route. So it's one of the things that for our little animals, they'll get up here on the edge and they fall in, they may not be able to get out. And so if you're in the hill country, you have plenty of rocks, the smart thing to do is to create a rock ramp on the inside and outside of the water to allow some access. Sometimes they use some floats that move around in the water source as well. And so that's very, very important to have for those guys. Let me think about this just a minute here. Let me pause just a minute.
Here, you can pause and think, and I'll start talking. So does that sound good?
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay. So this is just an old cattle trough here. So this windmill setup was built in 1979. And like I said earlier, we only run this when there's cows in the pasture or when we don't have the seasonal rain that we've had this year. So there is some maintenance that is involved with all of your troughs. Not only is it making sure that your critter escapes are up to date and they work, but there's a hole in the middle there where a float would go, and that float would keep this water at constant level. And that's really important, and you can see how we have that rebar over top of that. That protects the float. Raccoons and their pesky little thumbs will get in there and they love playing with that thing. I guess they think it's a crawfish, I'm not really sure. But they will tear that up, and before you know it, you've lost 1,000 gallons that you've worked so hard of that precious water to capture. So the maintenance of this is really important. And before we would fill this up again, all of the algae from the last time this went dry, we would clean this up. And by we, of course, mean the intern.
Let me ask you a couple questions about the placement of these troughs as well. So we're here in the hill country, we have a lot of topography. So if I'm a new landowner and I'm thinking about gravity feed, what do I do with my placement of a water source, a solar pump, or the trough itself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that all depends on the topography of your land. For us, with these perched aquifers, we don't have to dig super deep for that well to work. But the problem is then that sediment that builds up, and it gets to kind of a nightmare. So solar pumps are a fantastic option if you have a spring like we do, or even if you have a permanent creek or river, pumping up 1,000 gallons using one of those really inexpensive pumps is a great way to fill these troughs. And you don't have to go to the length that we did here with the cinder blocks. You can put up a poly tank, unless you're doing something like cattle where they require a little extra water. This is just for deer or for wildlife to supplement the birds and especially the quail. Right. You don't have to build it to this scale. So it all kind of moves down from there. But it all starts with that capturement. The way the spring systems work here on the Bamberger Ranch, our springs are up high. So gravity feeds all the way down. So we can run a line out of these troughs all the way downhill without the use of a pump. Right. Just using those float systems to keep that water. And let's say we had 3 of these troughs as you go downhill. Each one of those would require a float. When the one uphill fills up, the water is going to continue down the pipe. Then that one's going to fill up and it's going to continue down the pipe. When that one fills up, water stops flowing and your tank starts to recuperate some of the water that has sent downhill. And
I guess they could have stop valves where they wanted to put water where they wanted to.
Absolutely.
Or maybe some clean outs in case there was some problem in the line as well.
That's so important too. Maintenance of your lines. And for us, our water is extremely calcified. It has a lot of dissolved mineral in it, especially the well water that we have here. It's filled with a lot of gypsum. Right. And that's great for livestock, but it really it makes the lines very difficult to deal with after a couple of years. And so building in as many stop gaps and as many clean outs as you can makes sense, especially while you have the trench open. If you're going to go to all of that expense of putting a trench in and burying your line, you want to make it easy so that you don't have to dig it up and have to repair that every single time.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, perfect. And one of the things coming back to this escape ramp for wildlife that I noticed earlier is that the ramp itself comes all the way to the wall. So imagine this is filled with water, and what some people do will use expanded metal. So they'll have a ramp that goes into the pond, or into the trough rather, on the outside. But if that expanded metal doesn't have some block along the way, then the animal may just swim around until they're exhausted and they may perish in the water itself. So it's important for them to hit something, and then be able to escape out of the trough itself. So that's a modification I'd certainly do when I'm using those expanded metal wildlife ramps.
Yeah, and another thing too about your troughs and your critters, I hate when I see fences across a trough. A lot of people do that because then they think it's one water source serving two pastures, which is true.
Right.
But if you are in the hill country like we are, there's bats and there's other wildlife like swallows that need to be able to have that clear flyway to be able to drink water from that. Right. So don't just think about your cows, you know, think about your birds and bats and other wildlife too.
Right. Very good.
All right.
You know, one of the things when we're talking about supplemental water on ranches is to have good placement over the landscape. We've talked about topography, having opportunity for gravity feed. But in water catchment and rainwater harvesting, there's another thing that's really important, and that's the condition of the landscape itself. So as I rode into the Bamberger Ranch today, with all the lush vegetation that we've had, I think it's incredibly important, number one, to create a rangeland sponge. So whenever that waterfall comes, it doesn't hit a bare surface and then run off down to the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the things that we have here today is a guzzler. So this is commonly used, particularly in the western half of the state. But remember back to, when was it? In 11 when we had the drought record, right?
Yep, 14 inches across a year and a half here on the ranch. That was our rainfall.
So even in eastern Texas, having supplemental water was a huge thing in that part of the world. The other thing we got to think about is rain belts across Texas. And so in eastern Texas, we may get as much as 60 inches of rainfall. And then there's these belts that run north to south across Texas. And here in the hill country, about what are we in?
We're right in that weird 28 to 35.
Right.
So 28 on the eastern side of I-35, and on the or 35 on the eastern side of 35, and about 28 out here, 40 miles from 35.
Right. So as you come westward, these guzzlers become more common. So here we have an inverted roof, and on a shingled roof or an R-panel roof like this, in a 1-inch rainfall, you capture about 0.6 of a gallon of water. Yeah. So for this particular guzzler, what can we capture?
This is about 1,000 square feet, so we're right about 500-600 gallons somewhere in there. Right. And a lot of that too depends on how much wind is blowing when it's, but that's a really good, about a half gallon per square foot of capture service is a pretty handy tool to just kind of keep in mind.
Right. And so these guzzlers are built in different ways. This one's built low to the ground, which I appreciate. That's because if you get up high, gravity will always try to bring you down, and you certainly don't want to fall or be blown over the countryside as well.
Yeah.
So one modification though that I've seen for this type of inverted guzzler is they will raise it up about 8 feet tall, and that becomes an area of shade underneath the guzzler. You certainly have it here for smaller animals, but if you have it up higher, that's for larger animals or people who may want to come out for the opportunity to view wildlife as well.
Yeah, it makes a nice makeshift bird blind. And for here, the reason we don't have this a little bit higher is because we're not running cows or goats in this area.
Gotcha.
So this is an area that you might have remembered from the first iteration of Leopold Live. This is our food plot. Okay, so we have that double swing gate behind us where we can exclude wildlife or exclude livestock from coming in here, but still allowing wildlife. So they can just come in and out as they need. So they don't need that shade spot here.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is about 1,000 square feet. Okay, so if I did the math, or you do it for me.
That's about 500 gallons in a 1-inch rain.
All right, so water hits here, it comes to a central point in the middle, and it's funneled. We're standing
right here on an old septic tank that has been modified. It's a 500-gallon concrete tank, and it's buried. Now, if you have the ability to bury your tanks, you should. Not only does that keep the water cooler for wildlife, but it also helps prevent evaporation out of your tank. And one thing we have right here that's coming off the end of our gutter is we have our catchment system. This is our filter. So you can see we've got snail shell and we have some leaf material in there. And so you got to clean that out every now and again because you don't want that getting into the water. And the other thing that you need too, you need to know how much water you have. So we have modified the lid here, and I've got my very scientific measuring stick. So I can pull this cap, I can put my stick all the way down to the bottom, pull it up, and you can see we are full. Now when you have 21 inches of rain and it's just the first part of August, you are going to be full, which is great. But the water doesn't stop at this trough. it goes downhill, again, gravity fed, no pumps, downhill to the trough and water feature that we have just below us here.
All right, fantastic. And maintenance on this, it's well constructed. You got your R panel, you have your screws that go in. But remember, in West Texas, sometimes we get some high winds.
Yep.
So there may be some maintenance that goes along with these types of inverted roofs. But they come in different sizes as well, and different
Absolutely.
shapes, and some innovative ways to do it as well. So do you have to have R panel inverted roof?
No, you don't. You know, we're pragmatists here at the Bamberger Ranch. And you can build these as big or as small as you want. We have quail stations that are made out of little 50-gallon drums
Right.
with paneling that was left over from our science building construction.
Right.
So just little 2 or 3 square foot, because every little bit helps for wildlife, especially when you're only putting up a watering station for ground nesting birds.
Perfect. So if I had some corrugated tin, some 2x4s, even in eastern Texas,
Yep.
I would be placing these things to have good distribution across my ranch
Yeah.
for the large animals and for all the small ones as well.
Yeah, and the small animals often get forgotten about when you're talking about your tax valuation.
Yeah.
But if you have the wildlife valuation, you're probably not worried about cows. You're probably worried about more things like deer and quail, and my favorite, of course, reptiles and amphibians. Everything needs water.
Right.
So if you're building these on a smaller scale, you can put more in.
Right.
And somewhere between 1/4 of a mile and 1/2 or 3/4 of a mile is about the proper spacing, especially for the smaller water sources.
Perfect. And then if you are using cattle as a wildlife management tool, they'll certainly use the water as well.
Oh, absolutely. And
Right.
you would probably want to build a bigger storage tank for cattle.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, well, fantastic.
So gravity takes the water down from our modified septic tank into our water trough here. And this is a circular concrete tank. It does have a concrete bottom on this. That's important to point out too. And you don't have to do them out of concrete. You can get one of the corrugated tin and bury that. But you'll notice ours is buried. And again, that's just another thing to keep the water a little bit cooler. Now, when we talk about maintenance on the tanks, you can see the last time this was cleaned out was March. So we're getting to that area that we really want to open up the gates, allow the deer to come in and eat off the food plot, getting ready for hunting season in the fall. So we'll clean this out again. But there's also, on top of the cleaning out, there's some other things that we need to talk about too. Jim?
Yeah, one of the things when we walked up to the trough that I really liked was the bird perch #1. I haven't seen too many people do this, particularly when it's livestock country and modifying the troughs. Sometimes I will see a cedar stave or something across the tank, and that's good because it'll nearly be at water level and animals can use that to escape. So I love this idea, but the other thing that struck me when we came up here is the rocks that were in here. So we've got these honeycomb rocks that are typical here of the Edwards Plateau that are placed in the bottom of the tank. And the water's level is regulated, right? So this is going to be the top of the rock always. So you can imagine a bird having a place to land, and then it could hop on a rock or whatever. And recall that in the segment we did earlier, we talked about floating mats in these ponds as well. And that's certainly an option, but raccoons like those floating mats as well. They'll modify your mats and maybe remove them. They may make nesting material out of it themselves, but they're going to have a hard time getting this rock back to where they want to sleep for the night. So I love this idea of the rocks being in the bottom of the tank. And then of course the wildlife escape ramp as well. So this particular trough is nearly at ground level, which is perfect for wildlife. But here's access to the tank itself. There's a stair step, a rockway that goes into the pond. There's a barrier here if the animal is in there, a small rodent, a bird, or whatever. Snakes sometimes are in here as well. They'll hit this barrier and find the ramp and be able to escape. And so I really love the idea there. And of course, I like the natural look of the limestone rock here in the hill country as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not like we don't grow rocks around here.
Right.
So we've got plenty of it. And you'll also notice that this trough has this corrugated metal kind of half moon on it. So not only does this help keep the water just a little bit cooler, but what it's really doing is protecting our float from those pesky raccoons. So if we can zoom in here, you'll see this black floating bulb. This is the float. So there's a valve that's attached to the bottom of that, and when I push it down, water will start coming in. Maybe you can see that on camera, maybe you can't, but I can definitely see it from here. And so this trough will start to fill up, and as the water level comes up, the float will stop that from coming in. This is the maintenance phase of it. If a raccoon or a horse gets a hold of that and pulls it off, you could lose all of that water, and then you have to wait on that ever elusive rain. Well, most years, the ever elusive rain.
Right. Well, you know, even that, there's some modifications. Animals get their water in different ways. And so here, this would be free water, so they could go to a trough or a pond, a stream, or whatever, and drink that water straight away. There's the metabolic water that they get through digestion of seeds and those kinds of things. And then there's water that's tied up in the plants themselves. And so, for instance, in prickly pear cactus, it's about 85% water and about 15% solid material. And there's some animals like javelina in western Texas that just not only their food source, but that's the water. So there's a lot of ways that animals get water, but they'll use these troughs all the time.
All the time.
And I like the
Absolutely.
way that you have that R-panel lid on there to protect that from raccoons, but there's other animals that will get in here as well, sometimes to drink, but sometimes for thermal regulation, just to cool off. And so I've seen everything from raccoons to elk in these things in New Mexico, just getting in there and playing around.
Yeah, elk don't require a whole lot of water, and if there's water, they're gonna go find it. Whether you just pour a water bottle out, you're gonna find an elk wallowing in that within a few days. One thing I failed to mention earlier is that the bottom of this tank is actually sloped. So it has a deeper pool in the back where that half moon kind of protects it. And then it kind of ramped up, not only to help the smaller wildlife, but to keep that water a little bit cooler again. Just another one of those little tricks that you can do for that.
I think later on you're going to visit about cameras, but man, I would love to see a camera on this water trough to see who all's coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. In times of drought, putting cameras on watering stations like this are really, really important for two things. A, if you're going to go to all of the expense and the labor to put this in, you want to make sure stuff's using it, right? And then B, how cool would it be to find a mountain lion coming up here and using this? Right? So we'll talk a little bit about game cameras on a episode in the future.
There you go.
All right.
Hey, there's one more thought. So whenever I started doing rainwater harvesting, I was working with Billy Niffen in Menard County. So Billy really got the energy going for rainwater harvesting across the state. And one of his sayings was that don't pray for rain unless you can take care of it whenever it comes. And so this is a great way, not only the rangeland sponge that you've created here, but now this capture and the slow release of water for wildlife and livestock, I think that's just extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you think about Texas, it's just a matter of when we start the next drought cycle. And so all of the water storage that you can do, whether it's through your rangeland sponge, which is obviously the most ideal, but all these supplemental water things, even the 55-gallon drums, all of that adds up to keep the wildlife on your land and to help the biodiversity of your landscape.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Alright guys, I've just got two quick questions for you real quick. So the first one, curious about how much maintenance these types of systems require.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've talked about maintenance throughout the segment, but realistically what it comes down to is just routine checking of your water sources. Make sure your roof is still there, that it hasn't blown off. With the high winds and some of the tornadoes we get here, that is a real factor, especially as you move further west or get further up in the panhandle.
Didn't I see on the concrete 1989?
1989,
So
exactly.
it's been here a while.
It is, yes, it has.
Okay.
And by just checking on it, making sure that you have water in your tank routinely, that lets you know that your catchment system is actually still working, and that all your piping coming out of the tank is working. And then it's that valve, just like a toilet bowl float. That's how these valves work. And then just cleaning out the algae. This is getting to the point where there's a lot of open water still, which is obviously really good for the wildlife, and you will have different species that will eat some of the algae. But what you don't want is an algae to make the water hypoxic. You don't want such a big bloom. So we're getting to the point now where we will drain this tank. We'll take just a cap full of bleach and a 5-gallon scrub brush, and we'll just go in here, we'll scrub it out, and then we'll run the 50, 60 gallons, however big this trough is, through it once, and then through it again to fill it back up for the wildlife.
Is that typically kind of an annual thing?
That is at 2 or 3 times a year.
Okay.
And a lot of it depends on how much rain you've had.
I see.
So this trough was cleaned out in March, and so we're probably about a month overdue for that. But things have been so wet that we haven't really worried about it, because this isn't the only water source that animals have.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, good question.
Thank you guys. And then just one more real quick, thinking about these supplemental water stations, are you ever worried about wildlife disease being concentrated in this area, and what can you do to prevent that?
I'll start with this. Yeah, whenever you have sick animals, they tend to flock to the water. And when you have animals that carry parasites like Giardia or beaver fever, if for say like a rabbit were to get in here, defecate, and if it had a parasite, it would spread that parasite then through the water, and something else could come and pick that up, and the cycle would continue. But I think the biggest thing with routine maintenance is the prevention of wildlife diseases. That little bit of bleach really helps kill some of those egg masses in those parasites.
Right, and so, you know, we're not too far from a fence here for this guzzler. So I guess whenever you're out doing routine maintenance where you're thinking about the next food plot or the next prescribed burn, checking your fences for holes or whatever maintenance might be needed there, you also just kind of keep an eye on these water troughs to see if there's a problem going on.
Yeah, absolutely, because when you have a lot of sick animals, most species of wildlife, when they get sick and they're dying, tend to go to water. Dehydration is a really big factor when you're thinking about rabies or distemper.
They may be fevered.
Yeah, they may be fevered, so they want to go to water. And what we find very commonly here on the ranch with our raccoon population is raccoons come here and then they perish in the water, and then that water source essentially becomes a death trap for any animal that wants to drink out of that. So just keeping up with the maintenance helps you look at things like that too. And if you remember to the tank on the windmill, how we had that roof on there, that's another way to prevent birds from flying in there and poisoning your water too. Because you got just more maintenance is all.
That was a smart move. You know, there's I've run all over Texas, and it's really on the rare side when I see a covering over the pila or over the basin itself to prevent that. But you're right. If they don't do that, then they definitely have to have some means of escape to get them out of there.
Yeah, and water is just so precious in Texas in general. I mean, throughout the whole American Southwest, that the last thing you want to do is have to clean this multiple times because you missed, you know, the maintenance phase of it. You know, you miss a cycle or two, you can really cause havoc. And if we wouldn't be so flush with water, running that 100 gallons through here, that's a 500-gallon tank. You've lost now I'm an Aggie, you lost a fifth of your water with that.
Right.
You know, that's a lot if you're into a drought cycle.
All right, yeah, and then, you know, I guess the other thing that I think of with water sources is that distribution. I love to have good distribution across the ranch, and that also prevents, you know, particular concentration in any one area where you may have a problem.
Yeah, for sure. Great question.
All right, well, that was pretty exciting. Thank
Sure
you for joining our session of Leopold Live. Again, we'd like to thank all those speakers and those that participated with our session. Look for upcoming sessions over the course of the next year, and our hope is to cover these very specific topics that are of interest to landowners and natural resource managers.
That's right. And I'd like to thank once again the Natural Resources Institute for coming out here and helping us provide this valuable information. At Bamberger Ranch Preserve, we hope to have our programming, including our workshops and tours, back up and running by the fall, depending on how things go. So make sure to watch for both the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute and Bamberger Ranch Preserve on your social media channels, and make sure to check in every once in a while and see what we're up to.